Hey, what's up everyone? Mark Price here with DevSlopes.com, and I just briefly wanted to talk about thinking in React. And because I'm a big believer in teaching yourself how to learn, I want to show you what I do, or what I did in the beginning to understand React. So go to Google, or your favorite search engine, which is Google, of course, and just search for React, and open it up, and I click Get Started. And there's one here called Thinking in React, over here on the left-hand side. And I just want to briefly cover this because it's so important. So the idea with React is you take visual components. It's like the view and model view controller. You're creating visual components that are highly reusable. Okay, so that's the point of the app. The backend doesn't matter. Your backend implementation, how you're getting the data, you can use Firebase, you can use your own HTTP requests, you can use Flux architecture, you can use Relay. There's lots of different things you can do to bring data to your app, but React doesn't want to care about that. React just wants to show the components. So that's the very first thing I want you to think about. React is very view focused, okay? It's visual, view focused, reusable things. Okay, so when you're building a React component, which of course is a view component of some kind, you want to start with a mockup, and we've done this. Basically, draft up what you want to build. You can design it out, whatever you want to do, or put it in your head visually. Draft up what you want to do. In this case, they're talking about a list here, a search box that has a list of items and prices, okay? And, they kind of mock up the data here as well, too. What kind of data would we get? So you think of your component, think of the data that you want it to show, and you can mock it up. You can do it in JSON like they did it here as well, too. I don't typically spend too much time doing that because I usually just think visually what information do I want to send to my user, but you can mock up the data here as well too if you haven't created the backend yet. And then what they do is they break it up into a view hierarchy, as you can see here. So each one of these lines is a component. So this orange line is the overall component, this search box is a component, this green box is a component, the blue box is a heading component, and these are line item components. And in this case they are, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different components, one of each color. And basically the idea is the more you break up things, the more they can be used. So this line right here, this could technically probably be used in a different component in the future. Okay, so that's the whole point of breaking things down to the most modularized level as possible so you can make them very reusable. Now you don't have to, okay, you can decide how much you want to break your component up into. And I'll do that sometimes too. I won't just break down every piece if it doesn't make sense or if it's not necessary. Usually when you have list items though, every list item will be in its own component. And of course, look at this right here. See how it says football and $49, and then they have this one right here that's sporting goods. It's a bolded component. That could be two different components, but it didn't have to be. You could have made just one line item because they're very similar, and then you could have written code that dynamically says whether it's a heading or not. So when you're actually placing the component, you could have set a boolean on it saying heading, and then it would bold it, it would remove the price, and you could do that as well too. You can write actual logic to change how your view looks. Of course, if you're writing very complex code, it might make sense to break it off into its own component. So the real question you're going to be asking me, which I know you will, is, well, how do I know when do I break up components or how many I should break them into? I say don't overthink it, okay? Take your idea and get something functioning, okay, as fast as possible. Okay, get that component working, and then you can break it up from there if it makes sense. If you run into roadblocks, it might be time to start breaking out components. Just do trial and error. There's no one rule for everything. The more you break it up, typically the better it is, but you don't have to do it. Break it down into a bajillion components, okay? So third, this is important. This is what I do, okay, is build a static version in React. So what I do is before I connect the data, okay, I make it look nice and pretty. I finish it 100%, make it look just as pretty as I want it to be, okay, and with the end result on there. And maybe you're saying, well, I have images I'm grabbing from the internet or whatever. Well, what I do when I do that is I just put static images and I grab them, have them on my local file system, or I just load them from Imager, however you pronounce it. And I load those in there dynamically to get it to, or statically to get it to look the way that I want it to look. So I make sure I do not do anything else until it is looking just the way that I want it. Absolutely perfect in style and form. Okay. And then here's where it's talking about identify the minimal but complete representation of the state. Okay. So then the next step is after you've actually designed it out to make it look nice. Okay. And by the way, when you make it in this step right here, when you create the way it looks, you may not have broken it up into multiple components yet. Maybe it's all just one giant component, and that's fine. That's usually where I start. One giant component, and then as I have to get to the actual data step right here with the state where things can start changing. For instance, like if I have a list item that I need to have a hovering effect on, where it highlights when I'm hovering over it, then I'm like, well, I need to write the code for this. Okay, you know what? I need another component. I need a list item component so I can handle the state in there. And so design it out first, then start managing your state, how it's going to work. You can start breaking it down into multiple components to get that functionality that you need in your actual component itself. Okay, so identify the minimal but complete representation of the UI state. Identify where your state should live. Again, I kind of combine those two steps in one. We're just figuring out how are the interactions on the components going to be. For instance, if I click on a button that's on the most inner component, but it needs to call in a function that's on the upper component, how does that work? You just kind of define it, and this is just a process that there's no one way. It's really just breaking it down, seeing what works, using React to your advantage. And the cool thing about React is it almost kind of forces you to drop your data in from the top level and pass it down, like one-way data flow. And so it kind of forces you to do it the React way. So, it helps you to solve your problems. What I'm saying is there's not 10 different ways to necessarily get your problem solved with your component and the state and the actions that it's going to be performed. It has to be done in a certain way, which is really the React way. And so anyway, identify where your state should live. That's just kind of the process of taking this component and saying, where are the interactions going to be? Which level of the component? The upper level, this inner component or this inner component, define where those actions are going to take place, okay? Add inverse data flow. Okay, this is what I was just telling you about. Basically, data comes from the top down, okay? There is the notion of two-way data binding where data could come back, and you can do that. But in most cases, you're going to want to have your data come from the top down. So that's what I would do when I'm planning how the data is going to work. Picture it coming from the most outward component, okay? And then drop it in, and then go from component to component to component, pass it on in, and see how that's going to work. That's how I would design my components and my data flow. What I'm saying is don't have some data that gets downloaded from the internet on your most inner component and then somehow expect your outer component to have it. That's probably bad design as far as React goes, okay? Don't look at it that way. Design your components so the data comes from the top down, not from the in out. Of course, there are ways around it, but that's not the React way. So, and that's it says. I would encourage you to look at this document here, read it in depth. But if I could sum it all up, you mock up your component how you want it to look, get all the UI done, okay? And then once your UI is there, it's looking just the way that you want it to look, okay? Then you can start breaking it into multiple components, start setting the state. Where's the data coming from? How am I going to pass it down? All those different things. Then you can start thinking about those things. But it's not uncommon to even like build multiple components, just the UI only first. So some people actually build their whole web pages with static components, all the UIs there, getting it looking the way that they want, and then they actually go back later and they add the different state and the interactions and the data to the components. So there's multiple ways of approaching a project. How I like to do it is get the UI completed for my one component and then finish out that component completely from beginning to end, talking to the servers and everything, and then move on to the next one. So I don't like to build multiple components in a half state and then go and finish them up later. But that's my 2 cents. Go to this website, read this documentation, all of it, all the way through, and that's it for now, just like they said, and that's it. Mark Price here with DevSlopes.com. See you later. And remember, to get your free live help, go to devslopes.com and click on chat room. I'm there all the time, as well as a huge community of other students.